All right, it's 3 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Carl, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Great. Yep, I think we're all set. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar entitled Just Talk About It. I'm sure, as all of you know, last week was a very tough week as we learned about the deaths of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. There's been a lot of media attention and discussion about mental health over the past couple of days. So although this webinar has been planned for several months, today's topic could not be more current as we focus on mental health issues and how to recognize them and talk about them. So I'm really glad that you all could join us. I'm your host, Susan Halpin. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the New England region of the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. My office is located at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts. This webinar is being recorded. All of you will receive a link to the recording and the presentation slides, as well as some of the other resources that we talk about when the webinar is over. So the webinar will last about 40 to 45 minutes. We'll save all of the questions you may have for the end. So, you know, if you can jot them down, if you hear something or see something that makes you have a question, and just save it for the end of the webinar, and we'll take the last 10 to 15 minutes for you to ask Carl those questions. I just wanted to talk, for those of you who may not be familiar with the National Library of Medicine, I wanted to give you a few quick details. The National Library of Medicine is an actual physical library. It sits on the campus of the National Institute of Health, and it makes all of its library resources available to everyone free of charge. It's the largest biomedical library in the world, and it's one of the federal government's largest providers of digital content. The mission of the NLM is to advance the progress of medicine and improve public health by making biomedical information accessible to everyone. The NLM carries out its mission through a national network that has about 7,000 members. Anyone can be a member. Again, it's free. These network members are librarians, healthcare providers, public health professionals, educators, students, researchers, first responders, and consumers. The network provided training to about 77,000 people last year through webinars like this and through other events. The National Library of Medicine provides an extensive amount of information about substance use disorder, along with how to prevent and treat all kinds of addiction. So this slide is a listing of some of the resources, and at the end of the webinar, you'll receive this list with your recording link. The following is another resource list with information that's specifically geared toward teens and educators. And for those of you who may not know, all of the National Library of Medicine materials or resources are written by experts, they're peer-reviewed, and they're updated frequently. And this is another resource list you will receive. These are mental health resources from the National Library of Medicine and partner organizations. We also have an extensive list of K through 12 resources, so I'll include those as well. And this is one of our promotional flyers that groups the resources by subject matter and age or grade. And the last thing I wanted to bring to your attention as a resource that can be very helpful if you do any kind of programming. The national, or I should say the New England region, offers a book club kit to anyone in New England for your organization. It's called the Graphic Novel Book Club Kit. Graphic novels are novels written in comic book format. The combination of visual pictures and written word is very effective when discussing topics that may be difficult or bring up emotion. So for example, some of the topics we have book club kits for are addiction, aging, cancer, and mental health. A book club kit consists of 6 graphic novels, discussion questions, NLM resources related to the topic of the novel. Anyone in New England can borrow the kit free of charge. We will ship it to you, and we'll also include a return shipping label. And the coordinator in our office who is in charge of the Graphic Medicine Book Club kits is Sarah Levin-Lederer. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter for this webinar. Carl Antesil is the Director of Strategic Communications and Information Services for the Minding Your Mind organization. So Carl, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Pass me the ball. There we go. I got it. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me out. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. So my name is Carl Antesil, and you know, I work with Minding Your Mind to do mental health education in middle schools and high schools, not only in Massachusetts, but throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey as well. But today I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about myself because I personally am somebody who's in long-term recovery. And part of this presentation today is going to be me sharing those experiences. And then I'm going to share with you some of the best practices and some of the takeaways that I have seen be the most effective over the past couple of years doing this work. And then we'll leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end to talk about it. So if I bring you back a few years, in 2006, which is starting to sound farther and farther away, I was graduating high school. And at this point in my life, I had checked every box I was supposed to check. I had taken the tests that I was supposed to take. I completed the classes I needed to finish. And I had got, you know, I crushed the SAT score I was told I needed to get. And I got accepted to the biotechnology program at Rutgers University, which was the program that I wanted to go to. And when I got to this brand new city, I looked a lot like my other classmates. I was excited to meet new people. I was pumped to be away from my parents for the first time, you know, but unlike my other classmates, I brought with me to this new city, to this new place, a secret. I had developed an addiction to prescription opiates when I was in high school. And what had started as relatively innocent experimentation with alcohol and marijuana had turned into this whole other thing that robbed me of my college experience. I mean, I remember while everyone else was living that college life that they were promised, meeting all these new people, hanging out on campus, going out every night, and just like enjoying this next chapter of their life, I was trapped in my room in agony. I mean, if you've ever had the flu, you know a little bit about what this felt like. That freezing cold, can't stop sweating, bones hurt, muscles ache, nose run, head pounds. That pain was the loudest motivator in my life. It was so loud that it pushed all other thoughts, all other aspirations, all other priorities out of my head And in that pain, someone had said to me, do you know you can go and downtown and you can get heroin, and that'll make that withdrawal go away. And the truth is that word was scary where I grew up. I grew up in a nice suburb in New Jersey, central New Jersey. I went to a good high school. I got a good education. I was told I had potential and could do anything I wanted to in life. And for, the most part, that was true. And hard street drugs were not supposed to be on my list. But I found myself, after 1,000 tiny little choices at this point in my life, when I was in abject pain and someone said that this might make you feel better. And so in that moment of desperation, I made a decision that tore my life apart within a year. Got me kicked out of school, it got me kicked out of my house. That addiction ran my life for the better part of the next year and a half. And I became the addicted person that I thought I could never become. And I started that part of my story because when we have conversations around mental health, around drugs and alcohol, that's the story that we most often hear, right? We are intimately familiar with the stories of people's crisis. When we look in the news, when we look at the stories that we end up being shown about people who struggle, there are almost unanimously stories of people who have struggled publicly or people have passed away. And if I were to just tell you that one part of my story, I would be doing you a disservice, because although that was a very difficult and very public part of my story, that was just one part of a mental health journey that I had to take to get to that point and then grow out from that point to become the person in recovery that I am today. And so today I want to take you briefly through my story, and then I want to talk about mental health with that lens, that of viewing it as the entire arc of somebody's mental health journey, and not just focusing on the points of crisis, because the points of crisis are important conversations to have, that you potentially have the chance to save someone's life in those moments. But if that is the first and only time we are talking to people about their mental health, we're putting ourselves in a situation where it's going to be harder for them to hear us. And it's going to be harder for us to be present with them, because when someone's in crisis, it's difficult for everybody involved. But my mental health journey started way, way before I was, ever knew what drugs and alcohol was. This is a picture of me, just a couple years old. And in a lot of these pictures my parents have of me as a kid, I was a happy kid. But I know today that I was also struggling with an anxiety disorder. I have words to talk about what it was that I was going through. I know that my disorder has a name. I know that what I was experiencing were panic attacks. But at this point in my life, I did not know what was happening. All I knew is that life for me was really difficult, and it didn't appear to be that way for anyone else. And I want to be very clear that anxiety is not an inherently bad thing. I don't want to demonize anxiety for, any of our young people today. Anxiety today, for me, is a very healthy motivator, and it's a very healthy indicator. Anxiety is just like the rest of our feelings. When we experience it in a healthy way, it can tell us, it's our body telling our brain something, and it can help us work a little bit harder in the times that matter most. But at this point in my life, anxiety was crippling. And, I remember going to school and looking around and not understanding why everyone else seemed to have gotten this manual on life that they were following that I didn't get. I mean, they participated in recess, they answered questions in class. They didn't have this looming fear that was controlling their life every second of every day, and I could see that in their behavior. And I didn't understand why it looked so easy for them when it was so hard for me. And I began to hate that part of myself. I began to think that I was the only person in the world that understood what I was going through, because in my experience, from behind my own two eyes, that's the way it looked. And today I know that I was just wrong, right? That 1 in 4 of my classmates statistically struggled with a mental health disorder. So every classroom I've ever been in, every assembly I have ever sat in, every row of lockers I've ever been in has statistically had someone like me who struggled with their mental health. But at the time, I really felt like I was the only person in the world that knew, and more importantly, cared about what was going on with me, because we didn't really have open and honest conversations about mental health. And so the hardest part about this for me was not the fact that, it was not the things that people said about me or to me. I acted differently because of my anxiety. I was called weak. I was called crazy. I was called weird. Those things hurt. But for me, the hardest part about stigma was, the mark of disgrace that I put on myself, the self-stigma that I carried around my mental health, even from a very early age. And I put this definition from Google because the first time I read it, it really stuck with me, right? That a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. And mark of disgrace is exactly how I felt about my struggle with my mental health. It was something I was ashamed of, disgraced by, humiliated over. But like I said, the hardest part about stigma was that self-stigma. It was the way that I thought about myself when no one else was around. As I took those words home with me, and they would start to run circles in my head, and I would start to think, why did I behave that way today? Why is this so hard for me when it doesn't appear to be hard for anyone else? And what am I going to do when I have to go face all those people again tomorrow? And as those thoughts would swirl around in my head, the anxiety I would experience because of them would keep me from, having appetite. It would keep me from sleeping soundly, and it would make me just absolutely dread having to get back on that bus and do it all over again tomorrow, because today was a little worse than yesterday, and tomorrow I assume would be even worse. And I began to hate that part of me. I began to hate the fact that I thought I was different when I didn't think that anyone else was. And so I decided that I wanted to hide that part of me. I wanted to put on this mask and pretend that things were okay when clearly they weren't. And this is a pattern I see a lot, I hear a lot of young people tend to fall in. That because we don't have open and honest conversations about mental health regularly and often, regularly and consistently, like we do about our physical health, we develop this idea that when our mental health is not okay, that's not something we talk about until it gets bad enough that we have to talk about it with someone. And that can lead a young person to think that we should cover up this problem and hope that it goes away, when we would never ask them to do that about a physical ailment. If they were struggling with some kind of physical disability, if they had a medical condition that was chronically impacting the way that they were interacting with their world, we would encourage them to get treatment immediately, and we would support them as they had that treatment. When you see a student with a cast on, that student's cast is covered in signatures because we know from a very early age that they need that cast in order to heal. And we sign that cast to let them know that I'm here for you until you get well. But when it came to my anxiety, I didn't have any casts, I didn't have any scars, and the people around me didn't really have the lens of mental health to view some of my behavior through, to understand what was really going on. And so I decided to hide that part of me, because if I didn't like that part of me, you weren't going to like that part of me. And I didn't want you to feel as bad about me as I felt about me. And so I started to fall in this pattern of behavior of trying to disassociate from the feelings I felt about myself and about my mental health. And the mask that I wore was the first step I took. The first negative coping skill I had was the mask that I wore when I smiled and said things were fine when they weren't. But as the problem continued to get bigger, that mask didn't cover the problem as much, and I started to find myself resorting to other negative coping skills to find the same momentary reprieve or distraction. And before I moved to alcohol, you know, that looked like anger in my life. Anger was a huge negative coping skill, and in retrospect, a huge red flag for me. So if you think about the last time you were angry, we've all, you know, fallen into a rage, you know, about something at work, about, you know, a significant other. And when we get really angry, it consumes us, right? If you think about the last time that you really, someone just really got to you. Anger is an emotion that's very, very good at consuming us, at covering up everything else that we feel, and becoming the only thing we feel in that moment. And as a 12 and 13-year-old boy, I had a lot of fear, I had a lot of anxiety, I had a lot of stress, and I was very familiar with those feelings, and I did not like them. But when I would rage, when I would scream at a teacher, get in a fight with a friend, flip a desk, punch a hole in a wall, in that moment, the only thing I experienced was anger. And anger was not necessarily better, but it was different for the first time in my life. And I thought that different was a step in the right direction. And so anger became the way that I would, for a moment or for a night, cover up all of the other pain that I was carrying around with me every other second of every other day. And I didn't, you know, necessarily think that what I was doing when I was angry was a good thing to be doing. But I wasn't aware of any other options, and because of the mask that I wore, I wasn't comfortable telling people what was going on below the surface. And to be frank, not a lot of people were having those conversations with me. That anger was viewed as a discipline issue, which, in fact, it was. My behavior was not appropriate or really acceptable. But there weren't people that were doing, you know, digging a level deeper to figure out why I was having this pattern of behavior. And as I moved into high school, this cycle started to progress. And I found myself caught up in this, you know, the spiral of addiction that I did not really understand how easy it was to get sucked up in it, right? People had told me that addiction had a spiral. But I always felt that before I was mentally dependent or physically dependent, that I'd be able to make a decision to stop. What I didn't understand is that the spiral of addiction for me started before I picked up drugs and alcohol, and that I was really trapped in the spiral before I even used these outside substances. And once I did use these outside substances, they exacerbated it to the point where it spun out of my control quicker than I was really able to stop. Because for me, this was really all defined by having these internal narratives that I had to say out loud to somebody else. I would think things, they were like mantras, that I'm hurt because I feel different, that I feel alone in a room full of people, that I'm scared because no matter what I've done to try to feel better, things have only gotten worse, and I don't know what to do next. And had I said those things out loud, someone might have been able to break this cycle. But instead, I tried to bury those feelings under anger, and then as I got into high school, under alcohol. I tried, and that would allow me to take those feelings that I didn't want to touch and put them away for a moment or for a night. But you know, the anger would subside, or the alcohol I would sober up. And all those feelings would still be there on top of not only the old feelings, but the consequences of my negative coping skills, the loss of friendships, the, you know, the consequences from getting caught, or the negative feelings from, you know, being hungover the next day. And as this pile got bigger, my use started to increase if I wanted to ignore it for a moment or for a night. And this cycle led me into junior year, where I was introduced to prescription medication. And I do want to say to everybody on the call that the first dealers, the first people that I got my prescription medication from were parents of my friends who loved me. And they had no intention of me ever taking their medication. But I knew that people usually keep their medications in their bathrooms. And to me, you know, this is my little PSA, to this day, it astounds me that the one thing that as a young drug user, I wanted to take most from people's houses, they left in the only room that I could walk in and lock the door behind me. So if you take these medications, they are incredibly effective at what they are prescribed for. But if taken not as prescribed, they can be quite dangerous. So consider about where you keep these medications in your home. Because these, you know, expired prescriptions, old bottles that people forgot about, that is where my habit started. And the prescription medication took me from mentally addicted to physically addicted. It started to rewire the way that my brain worked so that if I didn't have them each and every day, that I would be in that pain. And pain is a powerful motivator. And once my brain was rewired so that if I did not have those substances in my system, that I would experience that pain, they became a priority in my life because as people, we don't like to feel pain. And it's a very insidious kind of pain. It's a nagging that is impossible to bring out of your brain. If you've ever been underwater for a little too long and you start to get that feeling in every nerve of your body as your brain starts to tell you that you really need to take a breath, but you don't just think it, you don't just feel it in your lungs, you can feel it in every inch of who you are, a longing to do a thing as you sit below the water. That's a very similar sensation to somebody who's withdrawing from a substance they're physically addicted to. And that, you know, that feeling drove me all the way to the beginning of this story where I was, you know, I was kicked out of school. I lived for a year of my life on the streets of New Brunswick, New Jersey, and I became the drug-addicted person that I thought I could never become. And there was a night where, you know, I was pretty hopeless. I didn't see tomorrow getting any better because evidence had told me that every day I woke up was a little bit worse. And I had no connection with my family. I didn't really have a connection with my friends. And I did not see a path to things getting better. And I ended up doing an amount of drugs that ended bringing me up into treatment. And in this treatment facility, I did not have willingness to change in the beginning, but there were some people that offered me some opportunities that really changed my mindset in a way that no one else had. And so I want to talk about a couple of those things because I think there are important takeaways from it. So the first thing is, you know, I was told I had to go talk to a therapist, and I had a lot of really incorrect ideas about what therapy was. I mean, you know, I thought that, one, only mentally ill people go see therapists, and I know today that that is not true. If you have a mental health diagnosis, like I do, I can get very specific, very effective tools for my specific diagnosis from a therapist, but I don't have to have a diagnosis to go talk to a counselor or a therapist. Because, you know, just like you can talk to a doctor for any range of physical ailments, I can talk to a therapist for anything that has to do about my mental health. I don't have to be in a mental health crisis in order to deserve that treatment. And frankly, I still quite enjoy talking to a therapist, even though we don't talk about anxiety much anymore. You know, I'm somebody who had a lot of trouble, you know, with self-image and being able to be confident in front of people. And today I can share this story confidently in front of a bunch of teenagers, and that's, in a high school. And that's not an easy audience all the time. And so my anxiety is part of my life, but I have tools that are really effective and deal with it today. We don't talk about drugs and alcohol much anymore. I've been sober for over 9 years. So when stuff comes up, maybe we talk about it. But by and large, the things we talk about are the things that most people could talk to a therapist about. I talk about my relationship. I talk about my self-image. I talk about my, work life. I talk about how to have a better relationship with my family and a better relationship with my friends. And I use that person to talk about things in a way that I can't really in other areas of my life, because it's not their job to have opinions, right? Their job is to be the support, to help me, and to have that sounding board, that mirror to bounce ideas off of, that don't have an agenda or an opinion that goes deeper than wanting to help me. It's super valuable. And I was only able to engage in that amazing, therapy experience because I had a counselor who was willing to level with me in that rehab. And I remember sitting down with this man, and he said, "Carl, do you deserve better than this?" And I said, yes. I looked around, and I had suffered and struggled more than I ever should have had to. I had no college degree. I had no belongings. I had no job. I had no hope. I had no future in my mind. So, yes, unequivocally, yes, I felt like I deserved better than that. And he said, well, I have everything you need to get where you want to go. I have all the tools. I have all the supports. I'm going to be here to cheer you on every step of the way, but the one and only person who can do anything about your situation right now is you. And so he's like, if you don't want to come in my office and you don't want to talk, that's fine. But if you want to use me as the resource that I am, I'll be here for you till the day, until you feel like you don't need it anymore. And he was the first person that took that ball, bounced it back in my court, and said, hey, this is your responsibility too. And by handing me that responsibility, he gave me the gift of empowering me to take control of my own mental health and my recovery journey. And instead of showing up and thinking that I was somebody who had been wronged or that going because I had to, he told me that I could come and talk to him because I deserved to. And I began to talk to him, and things did start to change. And now, in the interest of time, I might talk a little bit more about my positive coping skills specifically, but I'm going to touch on them later in this presentation. But I want to get to the slides that we want to talk about, right? And so it was not until I was 21 years old that I sat down and were given the tools and the supports that I needed throughout the rest of my life, even though they were available to me earlier and often. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about what this looks like, not only in my life, but in the students that I work with on a daily basis in schools. And I think that if we want to look at someone like me and say, what could we do differently? The first thing we want to do is we want to look at stress. Because not all people that experience, a mental health crisis, not all people who experience stress are going to experience a mental health crisis, but most people who have a mental health crisis can point to stress as a contributing factor. There's a confluence of things that go into it. But this is one of the things that we need to be aware of because stress is higher than ever in children's lives. And it's not just, mental stress, but, stress, especially in young people, often comes out physically. And so what I want to be clear on is that the factors that cause stress for people are individualized, right? So trauma is relative, and just because an experience is not stressful to you does not mean that it is not stressful to the individual. We can, through our lens of experience in life, say, we know that your reaction is not commensurate with the actual severity of this situation, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't feel that intense for that person. And the great example for me, I think, is heartbreaks, right? So, when we have a young person who's in their first, real relationship and they get their heart broken, they'll often say, this is the worst, life is futile, and it'll be a really difficult experience, and I empathize with that, because the first time I got my heart broken was difficult for me too. But as an adult, I woke up the next day and it hurt a little less, and I woke up the day after that and it hurt a little less, and now, years later, we tend to not remember those people. And so we know that, yeah, things in life can be really difficult, but through our lens of experience, we know that it can and will get better. But to the individual, experiencing a loss, a heartbreak, having something that goes on at home or at school, through their, life experience, that might be the most difficult thing that they've ever been through. And so we want to be a support to let them know that it does get better, but we want to be careful that we do not invalidate their experience, because the second that we invalidate their experience, it doesn't, by saying, it's like, pull it together, we know this gets better. And we'll talk about some ways about how to approach this, but when we do that, we don't necessarily help them with what they're feeling. We just teach them that we're not the person to talk to about this stuff with. And it's important that we have these conversations about stress, because when we don't have conversations about stress, the hormones that somebody is experiencing stress create can lead to depression in the brain, especially with adolescents, right? So as this brain is developing, when someone is under stress that they are not properly coping with, those stress hormones can lead to depression. And so, we want to be talking about positive stress relievers in these kids' lives. And positive stress relievers can look different for different people, but I think that it's important that we're encouraging people to explore these, to practice these, and that we're modeling these things ourselves. Because I found, as a person in recovery, the most powerful thing I can do for a peer is to model the behavior that I think would be best for them. And the younger my audience gets, the more true I find that to be. For young people, I find words to be very cheap. If what you do does not match what you say, they pick up on that very, very quickly. And so finding a way to prioritize, taking care of themselves, making sure that they're getting physical activity, that they're eating, that they have some kind of self-care routine. The typical ones are yoga or meditation. I find that teens often don't, love the super crunchy stuff. But, the idea of being mindful or finding time to be quiet or detached from the rest of the world is, I think, a very valuable thing to promote and model. Because when we don't encourage these positive stress relievers, we find, a story that looks very similar to mine, where students will resort to more negative stress relievers, where they can't externally express or vent or relieve the pressure, and they start to internally try to deal with that. And that can, look like anger. It can look like drug and alcohol use. We find that, disordered eating behaviors or self-injury comes from a very similar mindset of, I am in pain and I am going to try to use this item as an externalization of pain, as a locus of control. And so when we see these things, we want to be able to take action. And so I'm going to talk really quickly about depression and anxiety as separate things. So stress is a big possible precipitating factor. But we also want to look for a confluence of factors, right? So do they have, is there a family dynamic that's causing additional stress? Is there a family history of having that depression? Are there stressors in their environments, and are they exhibiting these behaviors? Just looking at the time here, I want to finish up. So in your slides, it talks a little bit about the different areas of the brain. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them because I do want to leave time for questions, and then if there's not enough questions, we can circle back. But the thing to pay attention to here is, the brain is not finished developing until someone is 25 years old. So when we're dealing with someone who is an adolescent, the impact of the decisions and coping skills they're having are immense because they're still developing an emotional framework that they're going to use for the rest of their life. So I want to talk a little bit about what we should look out for anxiety, because we see a lot of anxiety in schools. But how do we know if this is like what most kids are feeling, and the anxiety that maybe doesn't have to be addressed directly, and how do we know when it's becoming problematic? So for me, the things that I want to look out for are when it's getting in the way of the student being able to perform. The what if question is something, it's the trap that I see a lot of students get caught up in. And so, they'll say, I'm really afraid that I'm going to fail this test. Well, what if I fail this test? If I fail this test, then I'm going to fail this class. And what if I fail this class? Well, if I fail this class, then I'm not going to get in college. And what if I don't get in college? Well, then I'm not going to get a job. And if and they start to do this black and white thinking where if this one domino falls, what's going to happen? And they'll follow it to a completely unknowable conclusion. But that consequence, that thought pattern, can lead to an immense amount of anxiety, especially in young people. So helping them break the what-if cycle, I find, is really powerful. Somebody with anxiety is often going to feel powerless. It's going to be hard for them to stay engaged. And so being present with them and showing that you're a support can often help alleviate the immediate discomfort and unmanageability that comes when someone is having disordered anxiety. But if you deal with younger people, the younger your audience is, or the younger your students, or even your kids are, the more likely it is that their anxiety is going to express physically. And I cannot overstate this. When we do not have the words to talk about what we are struggling with, we tend to exhibit physical symptoms instead of, a mental narrative. And so if you have children who are having trouble breathing, having chronic nausea, having chest pains, headaches, these can be, especially if seen over a period of time, examples or signs that this person is experiencing anxiety that they might not even fully comprehend yet, right? And so by learning the symptoms, you're going to be more prepared to keep an eye out for what is happening, right? You do have to take all threats seriously. If someone is saying that their mental health is causing them distress, if they say they are in crisis, we have to treat it like a crisis. Even if we believe that the person is better than they're currently stating they are, we need to take all threats seriously because, especially with adolescents, their mental health, they're struggling with all the same changes that we all had to go through our teenage years. And so emotions, it feels like the volume dial is often turned up louder than it is, and that can be really difficult for a young person. So we also don't want to keep this stuff a secret. I'm going to talk in the next slide about building a team, but we can't do this stuff alone. I think a lot of times if we know someone's struggling, we want to help them by ourselves, and we don't want to out them because we're afraid of what that might mean for them or for us. But no one person can help bring somebody through a mental health crisis by themselves. And we also don't want to call their bluff because the threats are serious, but we do want to let them know that we listen and that we're there and we care about them. And what I want everyone to do is to view all of an adolescent's behavior through the lens of this idea, that they have a good reason for everything they do, and to them, it's a very good reason. So when I was punching holes in walls, that seemed like nonsensical behavior for everyone else in my life. But to me, like I explained earlier, I had a reason that I did that. Because when I punched that wall, the only thing that hurt was my knuckles. I didn't have that internal hurt anymore for that moment. And so that's not a good reason, objectively, but it was a good reason to me at the time. So as the adults, we always have to take the responsibility and start to say, we need to figure out what is this person's reason for doing what they're doing. And the first step we got to do is we got to look what's behind the mask. We got to ask ourselves that question. Okay, this anger is inappropriate. I don't understand why they're using drugs and alcohol in the way that they are. But something is behind that mask, and until we get to the root of that problem, all we're going to be doing is treating the symptoms, which is important. I think treating symptoms is important. It's a big, harm reduction can help keep someone well long enough to find true recovery. However, if we don't look at what's behind the mask, we're going to struggle to figure out, we're going to struggle to truly give them a lifestyle of recovery that's going to last a long time. Then we got to start to build a team. Who are the stakeholders, right? If you're a teacher, who's the nurse? What's your principal's role in somebody's mental health services? What are the counselors? What are the social workers? Do we bring in the parents, and how do we bring in the parents? And how do you really build a team that's going to be able to talk about how this person is doing so that you can see what is happening earlier? Because oftentimes we see signs that go ignored, because when we see those signs, we can write them off because maybe I only see this kid for 45 minutes a day. And so, yeah, they're sleeping more than they used to, or I've seen them get angry more than they've used to. But because I only see them 45 minutes a day, maybe I can just write it off as they're just a teen being a teen. But when we pull together the team and you realize that that kid is a frequent flyer in the nurse's office, that the principal has had to have multiple conversations about their behavior, that the parents have noticed the same changes that you've noticed, we can start to say, hey, separately we were kind of saying this is, maybe something we can just write off, but now that we're all talking together, we realize this is serious and we see the patterns. So we're looking for patterns of behavior over time. A lot of this can look like teenage behavior, right? People have interests who change. They have swings in their emotions. But when we start to see patterns of behavior over time, we have to have a conversation about it. I would also know your resources before you have to help somebody. Too often I see people, somebody comes to them asking for help, and right in the middle of that crisis, they start to look for the resources they have to help that person. And especially if you care about that person, it's going to be really hard to look for those resources then. So know your resources now. Talk to the people in your school. We started this in this slide deck. There is a great list of local resources that you can have on hand so that if you ever find yourself in a situation, you know the starting point. You have the list of numbers that you're going to go down and start calling so that you can feel prepared and in control in a situation where it's really easy to feel like things are out of your control. And first and always, focus on your self-care. If you are unwell, you cannot help. You are no help to anyone. If we are not taking care of ourselves, if we are not in a healthy place, we do not have the bandwidth to be available for someone else. So the 3 magic words I want to leave you with are tell me more. If you have a kid who comes to you in crisis and you don't know how to react, sometimes all you have to say is tell me more. We want to do more listening and less talking, and you will be astounded by how much information these young people will be willing to divulge if we offer them a listening ear, a moment of silence, and instead of judging or advising or telling, all we ask them to do is tell me more. And when we do that, in closing, you're going to be able to listen in. You're going to be able to validate, to let them know that their feelings are valid and that it's going to be okay. You're going to be able to offer your resources that you have on your list, and you're going to be able to maintain whatever you were doing in your self-care routine so that they can see that you are a stable and well person who is not only willing but capable to be the rock that they're going to need while they get better. I really appreciate you guys for coming out. If you or someone you know is ever struggling 24 hours a day, here is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. There are amazing employees and volunteers who are trained to help somebody who is in crisis, and it's not just if someone's suicidal. If someone is struggling with their mental health and they don't know who to call or what to talk to, they can text this number, call this number, 24 hours a day. And so I always keep this either baked into my memory or in my wallet because it's in addition to the list of resources that you're getting as part of this webinar today, this is something that you can use when you feel like you don't have anywhere else to turn. And to have that backup is a really encouraging resource to have, because you never feel like you have nothing to offer, because you always know you have this as a last line of defense. So in closing, do you guys have any questions for me about Minding Your Mind, about the programming we do in schools, maybe about specific situations that you might have found yourself in or someone you work with in? You can type it in the chat and we'll be happy to answer it.
So, Carl, I have a question while we're waiting for others to put them in the chat box. So when you were struggling, there was not one person in your life who actually said, tell me more? And if there had been, would you have opened up, or would you have needed to establish, more of a relationship? Or
so that's a great question. So I am a firm, I will say this often, there is no silver bullet, right? There's no one thing you can say to any one person that's going to completely have them pivot. These situations are complicated, and but for me, tell me more is more than just a thing you can say. It's almost like a frame of mind, right? That I want to be somebody who is an open book that wants to hear more, because everything you're feeling and thinking is valid. And I often think about how people talk to me about my academics and how that looked different than how they talk to me about my mental health, right? My mental health conversations that I had felt a lot like my conversations about the birds and the bees, right? We did it one time, it was very uncomfortable, and we never talked about it ever again, right? But academics, we talked about regularly, right? They knew my teachers, they knew my classes, they knew how much homework I had, and they had their finger on the pulse of what was happening. And so when things changed, there wasn't an intervention. There was, a polite conversation about, hey, I noticed you used to talk about this teacher or this topic a lot more, and I don't see you talking about that very much anymore. What's going on, right? And they could notice when things were changing earlier. And I think that's how we have to think about mental health, because there were people who genuinely wanted to help me, but but they were kind of islands of willingness in a sea of stigma. And so for me, an opportunity to get help and willingness to receive help didn't intersect until later in my life, because those two things happened pretty infrequently. Does that make sense?
It does. I really like that sort of comparison to it's a state of mind, because, you know, body language plays into that. You know, knowing that you're giving the person who needs the help, you're letting them know you have the time and you really care. And anyway, I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
So
and so that's really real quick. So that's why I really like Minding Your Mind's approach to in-school programming, because instead of having it be like feeling like an intervention, which is what a lot of the drug and alcohol education that I went through felt like. We talked about what a person's bottom looked like, and the conversation started and ended there. We try to have, you know, a person with lived experience take people through more of that journey so that we could, you know, really see what somebody's struggle with addiction looks like, and understand that it, you know, the story is more complicated than just their use of substances. That there's often, you know, it's compounded by mental health concerns, there's environmental factors, and that when we see it as a picture, you know, a bird's eye view, we understand that it's much more complicated than this person made a bad decision around a substance. And when we see it that way, we can treat it for what it is, and we can really humanize that person and give them the kind of treatment and respect that they're going to need, because recovery from an addiction is often recovery from multiple mental health factors. And that's a long, drawn-out process that isn't easy and takes a lot of work and a lot of support for someone to make it through.
Oh, thanks. I'm not seeing any questions here.
So, I mean, if any come up, I'd be happy to answer them, you know, to you directly later, or I can just hang out for a few minutes if any questions pop up, or you can wrap it up if you'd like.
So you know something, I think people may be interested in your organization. If you could tell us a little bit about Minding Your Mind.
Sure. So Minding Your Mind, we have a couple different kinds of programs. They're all mental health education programs, primarily to middle schools and high schools, but we also support, you know, community organizations. We do plenty of parent presentations that, you know, we'll do work with universities or churches. But our main objective is to reduce the stigma through education. And so what we do primarily is we have about 20 different presenters who the majority have lived experience with a mental health diagnosis, and they work with me and a clinical director to develop a presentation similar to this one that's really trying to connect with students and teachers to show them what mental health looks like, which we find to be very effective for stigma reduction, and to really understand how can we be a part of the prevention conversation by understanding what do the red flags look like sooner, and how do we take action on those you know, red flags as soon as possible. And we have a grant in Massachusetts that allows us to do those programs at no cost. And so if you're interested in having a community presentation or bringing one of our speakers into your school, you can go on our website, mindingyourmind.org. And there's a book a speaker form. You can fill out that form. And really what that does is it triggers everything in our back end. You don't have to have all your details all buttoned up, but that lets our director of school programs know that you're interested and you want to learn more. And she'd be happy to answer all of your questions and talk about how to get a program for, you know, a community organization or a school that you'd like to have us out at.
Thanks, Carl. So one of our participants just sent me a private message, but I think it's worth repeating to all of our attendees is that, you know, she really appreciates the point about saying something to the kids and or anyone who we may see is struggling. Many times they're waiting for someone to say something because they don't know how to ask for help themselves.
Right, right. That's 100% true. And don't be surprised even when you do ask if that person is initially has an aversion to you asking. It doesn't mean that they don't want help. It means that they didn't know how to ask. And oftentimes they're afraid of what asking for help might mean. And so just because you say, hey, I noticed something's going on, and if they're like, oh, I'm fine, leave me alone, that doesn't mean that they didn't hear that you're an open door that they can walk through. And I encourage you to have the courage to ask that question again. And if you're really worried, to push the issue, because people, you know, it's a big leap for someone to accept help. And there's often a lot of stigma and a lot of shame that they carry personally about it. And so we need to be the ones who have the courage and the patience and the compassion to help them take those first couple steps, because they can be so, so difficult, but it's so, so worth it. And they're going to really struggle to find that strength and conviction on their own. And they often need an advocate like us to help them take those first couple steps so that they can finish the journey on their own 2 feet.
Great. All right, so I'm just putting the name of the organization again in the chat box. It's mindingyourmind.org. Carl, I want to thank you for sharing your story and for the valuable resources I feel like I received from listening to this webinar about how to talk about mental health. I just wanted to remind our participants that there is continuing ed credit for the Medical Library Association, and if you are going to apply for that credit, we will need you to complete the evaluation and use the evaluation code SubUse2, and that way you can get your credit. I wish that I could get credit for all of our other participants as well. We are looking into that. It just gets expensive for some other organizations. Even if you are not getting continuing ed credit, we would really appreciate your feedback on this webinar. So if you could fill out the evaluation, we would love to hear your thoughts. If you can think of any other topics that you would like to hear about from us, we're very interested in that feedback as well. And I think that's about it. You all should receive your evaluation link and all the resources that I mentioned at the beginning. We have some fabulous resources that, as I said, are current and peer-reviewed. So anyway, thank you again, and I think we're going to end it here. All right, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Carl. Bye now.